February 12, 1945. The Carpathian Mountains. The cold was not just cold. It was a living thing, suffocating and absolute. The kind that turned exhaled breath into hanging clouds of vapor that lingered in the air like ghosts waiting to betray you. Sergeant Victor Resnick crouched in the snow-covered ridge, his rifle pressed against his shoulder, his body carved into perfect stillness. 20 meters below him, moving through the skeletal forest in near-total darkness, came the sound he had been tracking for the past 11 minutes. Footsteps careful, deliberate, German infantry, advancing in tactical silence toward the sleeping American positions, half a mile behind him. Resnick could see nothing. The moon had set hours ago, and heavy clouds smothered what little starlight might have filtered through the pine canopy. Standard protocol was explicit. No engagement after dark without visual confirmation. Hold position, observe only, report at dawn. But Resnick wasn't observing with his eyes. He was listening to something most men would dismiss as wind through the trees or the settling of snow on branches. He was listening to breath. In air this cold 14 degrees below zero, every exhale created a faint crystalline sound as moisture froze mid-air. It was barely audible, a whisper beneath the silence, but Resnick had learned to hear it the way a wolf hears a heartbeat. He counted the rhythm, steady, controlled military breathing. At least 30 men, moving in staggered formation, their exhalations creating a pattern that mapped their positions as clearly as footprints in fresh snow. His finger rested beside the trigger, trembling not from cold but from the weight of what he knew he had to do. Order said wait. Instinct said now. And between those two truths men would live or die. But to understand how he learned to kill by listening, we must return to when he first learned to survive by silence. Victor Resnick was born in 1919 in a village so small it didn't appear on most maps, tucked into the Carpathian foothills, where Romania meets Ukraine. His father Dmitri was a hunter, not by choice but by necessity. In winters when the ground froze too hard to farm, the forest provided what the soil could not. Victor began accompanying his father into the mountains at age 7, learning lessons that had nothing to do with marksmanship and everything to do with patience. "The mountain teaches you to wait," his father would say, kneeling beside him in pre-dawn darkness. "The prey teaches you to listen, and the cold teaches you to be still." They hunted deer and boar, often in conditions where visibility was measured in feet rather than yards. Dmitri taught his son to move during the wind, to freeze when it stopped, to time his breathing to match the rhythm of the forest itself. But the most crucial lesson came on a morning when Victor was 12 years old, tracking a wounded stag through heavy fog. He had lost the blood trail, lost visual contact entirely, and then his father placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered, "Close your eyes. Tell me what you hear." Victor listened. At first only wind, then beneath it something else, a faint huffing sound, rhythmic and labored. The stag's breathing amplified by the cold air, audible at nearly 40 meters despite the fog. They found the animal by sound alone, and Dmitri made his son kneel beside it as it died. "Remember this," he said. "Breath is the one thing no creature can hide. Not in cold like this. It's the sound of life itself. And if you can hear it, you can find anything." That philosophy became the foundation of Victor's hunting technique. While other boys learned to shoot at targets, Victor learned to shoot at sounds. He practiced in darkness, in fog, in conditions where his eyes were useless. By 16, he could track a deer through a blizzard, using only the acoustic signature of its respiration against the frozen air. It was an unusual skill, almost preternatural, and it made him one of the most successful hunters in the region. His father died in 1938, lungs ruined by years of breathing mountain cold. Victor buried him on a ridge overlooking the valley, and a year later, when war came rolling across Europe like an avalanche, he enlisted. Not out of patriotism or ideology, but because the world he knew was ending, and he suspected the skills his father had taught him might be the only things that would keep him alive. The boy who hunted deer would become the man who hunted men. But the mountains remained the same. By February 1945, the war had become a frozen, grinding nightmare. The Carpathian front was a place even generals spoke of with dread, a labyrinth of snow-choked ravines and skeletal forests where visibility was measured in yards and temperatures routinely plunged below zero. The Allied advance had stalled here, not because of German strength but because of terrain and weather. Units held positions for weeks without relief, dug into frozen earth, surviving on reduced rations and prayers that frostbite wouldn't claim their fingers before enemy bullets claimed their lives. Resnick's unit, a mixed company of American and Romanian forces, was positioned along a ridge system that overlooked what intelligence called a quiet sector. Quiet in this context meant the Germans weren't launching frontal assaults. Instead, they were doing something far more dangerous: night infiltrations. Small teams of elite troops, often Waffen-SS mountain specialists, probing Allied lines under cover of darkness, mapping weaknesses, cutting communication lines, and occasionally massacring entire outposts before disappearing back into the forest like phantoms. Standard defensive doctrine was clear. After dark, sentries maintained watch positions, but engagement was forbidden without visual confirmation. Flares were used sparingly due to limited supply. Radio communication was unreliable, the cold draining batteries and German jamming disrupting frequencies. Units operated in near isolation, each position a small island in an ocean of darkness and snow. Resnick found this doctrine increasingly inadequate. He had been reporting unusual sounds for 3 weeks. Movement patterns in the valleys below, acoustic signatures that didn't match wildlife or wind. He logged them meticulously, noting times, directions, estimated distances. His company commander, Captain Warren, reviewed the reports with barely concealed skepticism. "You're hearing things, Sergeant," Warren said during one briefing. "We've had observers out there with nightscopes, nothing. No movement detected." "Nightscopes can't see through fog and snow, sir," Resnick replied. "But sound travels differently in cold air. I'm tracking breathing patterns and footfall cadence. There are German patrols operating within 200 meters of our perimeter, almost every night." Warren sighed. "Even if that's true, and I'm not convinced it is, we can't authorize engagement based on sounds that might be wind or animals. You know the ammunition situation. Every round has to count, visual confirmation or nothing. Those are the rules." Resnick didn't argue further, but he knew the captain was wrong. The sounds he was hearing weren't wind. They were men. Professionals who knew how to move silently, who understood that darkness was their greatest advantage. And sooner or later they would find a gap in the Allied defenses and exploit it. Desperation is the mother of invention. And on the Ghost front, desperation came every night. Resnick began conducting his own experiments. If he couldn't convince command through reports, he would need to develop a method so undeniable it couldn't be dismissed. He started by mapping the acoustic properties of the terrain, noting how sound traveled differently through various weather conditions. In heavy snow, high-frequency sounds were dampened, but low-frequency vibrations carried farther. In clear, cold air, every noise seemed amplified, especially the crystalline whisper of freezing breath vapor. He developed what he privately called the silent breath technique. It wasn't complicated, but it required discipline that bordered on superhuman. The method involved controlling his own respiratory cycle to create intervals of absolute silence, allowing him to isolate and identify external sounds with precision. He would inhale slowly over 8 seconds, hold for 4, exhale over 8 more, then hold again for 4. During those 4-second holds, he became completely still, his own body producing no sound whatsoever. In those windows of silence, he could hear things other men couldn't, breathing patterns. The Germans were well trained, but they were still human. In sub-zero temperatures, No amount of discipline could prevent the body from needing oxygen, and every breath, especially in air this cold produced sound, Resnick learned to distinguish between panicked breathing, controlled military breathing, and the labored respiration of men carrying heavy equipment. He could estimate distances based on acoustic clarity. He could count personnel by tracking individual breathing rhythms within a group. He began creating detailed maps, marking suspected patrol routes and frequencies. He noted that German teams favored moonless nights and moved most aggressively between 0200 and 400 hours, when Allied sentries were statistically most likely to be fighting exhaustion. He identified what appeared to be 3 separate infiltration teams, each with distinct movement patterns and operational signatures. His spotter, Corporal James Dalton, watched these preparations with growing unease. Dalton was a by-the-book soldier from Pennsylvania, a man who believed rules existed for good reasons, and breaking them invited chaos. "Victor," Dalton said one evening as Resnick sketched another acoustic map by candlelight, "what you're doing violates engagement protocols. If you act on any of this without visual confirmation and authorization, it's insubordination at minimum." "Court-martial territory." Resnick didn't look up. "If I don't act, James, men die. That's not your call to make. That's what officers are for. Officers are 5 miles behind the lines with functioning heaters and hot coffee. We're here. We can hear what they can't. Sometimes the book is wrong." Dalton fell silent. He wanted to argue, but he'd been on the line long enough to know that doctrine and reality didn't always align. Finally he said, "If you do this, I'm with you. But I need you to understand the cost." Resnick met his eyes. "I understand. But the cost of doing nothing is higher. Every soldier faces a moment when the book of war and the reality of war are written in different languages. The night of February 12th began like dozens before it. Temperature 14 below, cloud cover complete, visibility essentially 0 beyond 30 feet. Resnick and Dalton occupied an observation position on the ridge's edge, a shallow depression reinforced with logs and camouflaged with snow. Their orders were standard. Observe, report, do not engage without authorization. At Irowo 1:47 hours, Resnick began his breathing cycle. Inhale, hold, exhale, hold. In the 4-second window of silence he heard it. Faint, almost subliminal, but unmistakable. The crystalline whisper of breath freezing in cold air. Multiple sources, moving in coordination. He opened his eyes, though they told him nothing. The darkness was absolute. He listened through 3 more cycles, building a mental map of what he was hearing. At least 40 individuals, moving in tactical formation, approaching from the northeast valley, using the ravine system to mask their advance. Based on breathing cadence and footfall weight, they were carrying heavy equipment, and they were moving directly toward a gap in the Allied perimeter that protected the main supply route and command bunker. "James," he whispered, "we have incoming. 40 plus personnel. Northeast ravine. 200 meters and closing." Dalton raised his binoculars, saw nothing but darkness. "I can't confirm visual, Victor." "I can't see anything, I know. But I can hear them. They're carrying flamethrower units, probably explosives. If they reach the supply depot undetected, they'll destroy our entire stockpile and cut off the regiment." Dalton reached for the radio. Static greeted him, the cold having drained the battery below functional levels. He switched to the backup unit. More static than a faint voice. "Overwatch, this is Command. Report status, over." Dalton keyed the mic. "Command, Overwatch. We have possible enemy movement. Northeast ravine. Request immediate alert status for supply depot and authorization to engage." Over. The response took 30 seconds. When it came, the voice was clipped and dismissive. "Overwatch negative. Observation posts 3 and 7 report no movement. No visual confirmation across entire sector. Maintain position and continue monitoring. Do not engage without visual confirmation and authorization." "Command out." Dalton set down the radio, his expression grim. "They don't believe us." Resnick continued his breathing cycle, tracking the advancing patrol. They were 150 meters out now, moving with practiced confidence, clearly unaware they'd been detected. Through the acoustic signature, he could identify the formation structure. Pointman, main body, rear security, officers in the center of the column, radio operators identifiable by the metallic clink of equipment against web gear. They'll be in position to strike in less than 10 minutes, Resnick said quietly. 27 men in that depot, most of them asleep. If those Germans reach the perimeter undetected, it's not a battle, it's a slaughter. Dalton's jaw tightened. Victor, the orders were explicit. We have no authorization. I know. If you fire without visual confirmation, it's your career, maybe your freedom. I know. And if you're wrong, if those sounds are something else, they're not. Dalton looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his rifle and settled into spotting position. Then we'd better make every shot count, because after this we're either heroes or prisoners. In the space between one breath and the next, the world divides into those who act and those who wait. Resnick settled into firing position. His rifle was a modified Springfield, accurized for precision shooting, fitted with a scope that was currently useless in the darkness. He wouldn't be aiming with his eyes. He would be aiming with his ears. He began his breathing cycle again. 8 seconds in. 4 seconds hold. In the silence, he isolated the lead German's position. The pointman's breathing had a slight whistle to it, probably a sinus issue. The sound placed him at 140 meters, slightly left of center from Resnick's position. He would be the first target. Resnick adjusted his aim by sound alone, angling the rifle toward where his acoustic map told him the target stood. He compensated for distance, cold air ballistics, the slight wind from the west. Then he exhaled halfway, finding the natural respiratory pause where his body was most stable, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's crack shattered the night silence like breaking glass. 140 meters away in the darkness, a man collapsed. The Germans, trained to react instantly to contact, dove for cover and began returning fire. But they were firing blindly, unable to identify the source of the shot. They had no idea they were fighting an enemy who didn't need to see them. Resnick cycled his bolt, listening. Through the chaos of panicked breathing and shouted German commands, he isolated the next target. The officer, identifiable by his position in the formation and the authoritative tone of his voice. 15 degrees, right? 135 meters. Resnick adjusted, fired. Another figure dropped in the darkness. The German patrol erupted into full chaos. Without leadership, without visual contact with their attacker, their tactical discipline began fragmenting. Some men fired into empty darkness. Others attempted to advance. A few began retreating. Resnick continued firing with mechanical precision, each shot guided by the acoustic signature of breathing patterns. The radio operator. The sergeant attempting to reorganize the patrol. A man carrying what sounded like a heavy fuel tank, likely for a flamethrower. 7 shots. 7 targets down. The Germans, unable to comprehend how they were being engaged with such accuracy in absolute darkness, broke formation entirely. What had been a coordinated infiltration unit dissolved into scattered individuals fleeing back down the ravine. Behind Resnick, the Allied supply depot came alive. Flares shot into the night sky, finally illuminating the scene below. The retreating Germans, now exposed in the sudden light, were caught in open ground. Machine gun fire erupted from defensive positions. What remained of the patrol was cut down within seconds. Dalton was already breaking down their position. Every artillery battery in the sector heard those shots. We need to move now. But Resnick remained frozen, staring into the valley below where the flares were burning down. In the dying light, he could see what his ears had heard. Bodies scattered across the snow. The lead elements of what would have been a devastating attack, stopped cold by shots fired into darkness by a man who trusted what he couldn't see. 27 men in that depot, Dalton said quietly. They're alive because you ignored every regulation in the book. They're alive because the regulations were wrong, Resnick replied. They abandoned their position 30 seconds before German artillery began pounding the ridge. As they made their way back through Allied lines, Resnick knew what awaited him. Questions, investigations, possible charges. The military didn't celebrate soldiers who broke the rules, even when breaking them saved lives. What he couldn't know was that the patrol he'd stopped was only the vanguard. Intelligence would later discover that the Germans had positioned a battalion-strength force in the valley, waiting for the infiltration team to secure the supply depot and eliminate command staff. If that attack had succeeded, the entire Allied position in the Carpathian sector would have collapsed, potentially delaying the advance into Germany by months. But none of that mattered in the moment. All that mattered was getting back to face the consequences of doing what he knew was right. Victory always arrives with paperwork, and questions no one wants to answer. Dawn broke grey and cold over the Carpathian ridgeline, revealing what the darkness had concealed. 23 enemy dead, scattered across the approaches to the supply depot. Not a single Allied casualty. The bodies showed a pattern that puzzled the officers who arrived to investigate. Every kill shot was precisely placed, center mass or head. Despite being fired in complete darkness at ranges exceeding 100 meters, Captain Warren found Resnick and Dalton in the command bunker, waiting under armed guard. Warren's expression was unreadable as he studied the younger man. "You disobeyed direct orders," Warren said without preamble. "Engaged without authorization. Without visual confirmation, you fired 8 rounds into complete darkness and somehow killed 7 enemy soldiers with 7 shots." He paused. "So I'll ask you once. How?" Resnick met his gaze steadily. "I tracked them by listening to their breathing patterns, sir. In cold air, breath vapor crystallizes and produces an audible signature. I developed a technique to isolate those sounds and use them for targeting." Warren's eyes narrowed. "You're telling me you shot men you couldn't see by listening to them breathe?" "Yes, sir. That's impossible. The bodies in the snow suggest otherwise, sir. A major from regimental intelligence, a man named Keller, stepped forward. He'd been standing in the corner observing. Captain, if I may, I'd like to hear more about this technique." He turned to Resnick. "You said you developed a method. Explain it." Resnick spent the next 20 minutes describing the silent breath technique, the acoustic mapping, the years of hunting experience that had prepared him to hear what others couldn't. Keller listened intently, occasionally taking notes, asking precise technical questions that suggested genuine interest rather than skepticism. When Resnick finished, Keller turned to Warren. "Captain, I need to borrow your sergeant. Regiment will want to hear this directly." "He violated standing orders, Major. There need to be consequences." "There will be," Keller replied. "Just perhaps not the ones you're imagining." Over the next 72 hours, Resnick found himself pulled from frontline duty and brought before a series of increasingly senior officers. Each interview followed the same pattern: skepticism, detailed questioning, then a request for demonstration. Resnick would enter a darkened room, use his technique to locate personnel by their breathing alone, and prove that what sounded impossible was merely improbable. By the 3rd day, the tone shifted from investigation to evaluation. A colonel from Special Operations arrived, accompanied by technical specialists, whose questions focused not on whether the technique worked, but on whether it could be taught to others. "Most soldiers won't have your background," the colonel said during one session. 20 years of hunting experience in mountain conditions. Can this be learned, or is it something unique to you?" Resnick considered. "The breathing control can be taught. Anyone with discipline can learn that. The acoustic mapping takes practice, but it's a skill, not a gift. The real limitation is environmental. It only works in specific conditions. Extreme cold, minimal ambient noise, clear air. In rain or wind or moderate temperatures, the effect disappears, so it's situational. Very, but in those situations it's decisive. The colonel nodded slowly. We're not going to court-martial you, Sergeant. In fact, we're promoting you, Staff Sergeant, and we're assigning you to work with our training cadre. We want to see if we can develop this into a doctrine, even if it's only applicable in limited circumstances. Resnick was stunned. Sir, I violated direct orders. You saved 27 lives and prevented a breakthrough that could have collapsed our entire position. Sometimes regulations and reality don't align. The Army is learning slowly to value initiative over blind obedience. The colonel smiled faintly. Though we'd prefer if that initiative didn't involve quite so much disobedience. Over the following weeks, Resnick worked with select teams of scouts and snipers, attempting to transfer his technique. Results were mixed. Some soldiers picked it up quickly, discovering they had latent auditory sensitivity they'd never developed. Others struggled, unable to quiet their minds enough to hear the subtle sounds that Resnick navigated by instinct. But even a 10% success rate meant dozens of soldiers across the theater who could now operate effectively in conditions previously considered impassable. The technique was never formally codified. It appeared in no manual, received no official designation. It was too dependent on individual skill and environmental factors to become standard doctrine, but it was quietly taught, passed from instructor to student, mentioned in classified after-action reports. By war's end, scattered records documented at least 40 successful night engagements, attributed to soldiers using variations of Resnick's methods. The Germans never understood what had changed. Intelligence reports captured after the war showed they'd concluded the Allies had deployed some new form of acoustic detection technology. The truth, that a Carpathian hunter had simply adapted techniques learned from his father, was too improbable to consider. Resnick survived the war, received multiple commendations that never mentioned the specifics of his technique, and returned home in late 1945. He didn't speak much about his service. When he did, he focused not on the killing but on the listening, the patience required to hear what others couldn't, the discipline to trust your ears when your eyes told you nothing. Some innovations are too strange to celebrate. They live in whispers, in margins, in the memories of those who were saved by what should not have worked. Decades later, in 1987, a researcher compiling oral histories of unconventional combat techniques tracked Victor Resnick to a small town in Vermont. He was 68 years old, retired, spending his days woodworking and teaching his grandchildren to hunt. The interview was brief. Resnick was reluctant to discuss details, but he agreed to demonstrate the technique one winter morning when temperatures dropped below zero. They stood in a forest clearing, breath vapor hanging in the air. The researcher, a former Marine, positioned himself 40 meters away and attempted to move silently through the trees. Resnick, standing with eyes closed, raised his hand and pointed directly at the man's position. Then he held up 3 fingers. The researcher had exhaled 3 times during his approach. How? The researcher asked, returning to where Resnick stood. Breath is the one sound that can't be disguised, Resnick replied. Not in cold like this. Every living thing announces itself. You just have to know how to listen. Did they ever adopt your technique officially? No, too specialized, too dependent on conditions and individual ability. But it was taught, quietly, to people who needed it. He paused, looking out over the snow-covered forest. I've received letters over the years from men I never met, saying the technique saved their lives in Korea, Vietnam, places I've never been. So it survives, not in manuals, in practice. The researcher asked if he had regrets about that night in 1945, about disobeying orders. Resnick thought for a long moment before answering. I regret every life I took, he said finally, all 37 of them. I remember the sound of each man's last breath. He turned to face the researcher. But I don't regret breaking the rules. because the alternative was listening to men I could have saved die in their sleep. Some choices don't offer good options, only less terrible ones. The interview was included in a limited circulation military journal, read by perhaps a few hundred people. Resnick died in 1996, buried beside his wife in a cemetery overlooking mountains that reminded him of home. His obituary mentioned his military service and his carpentry business, but not the technique that had made him briefly legendary among specialists who operated in darkness and cold. The technique itself has largely been superseded by technology. Modern thermal imaging and night vision equipment make acoustic tracking unnecessary in most combat situations. But there are still places, still conditions, where electronics fail and only the oldest skills remain effective. And in those places, instructors still sometimes tell the story of the Carpathian sniper, who learned to kill by listening to the one sound no one can silence: breath vapor rising in cold air. A universal signature of life, the proof that something living moves through the frozen world. Viktor Resnick learned to read that signature the way some men read maps or stars. And on a February night when darkness seemed absolute and death approached in silence, he proved that the most dangerous weapon isn't always the one you can see. It's the one you hear coming.